The ballroom shimmered with golden light, crystal chandeliers scattering reflections across marble floors. But none of that beauty touched me. I stood frozen, clutching a tray stacked with empty glasses, while my parents' voices carried across the crowd. "Don't mind her," my mother said, smiling at the guests, her tone laced with fake warmth. "She's used to cleaning up after everyone. It's the only thing she's good at." Laughter rippled through the room. My father nodded approvingly, his arm draped proudly over my brother's shoulder, the real success of the family. I felt their eyes on me, dismissive, mocking, stripping me down to nothing. And then, a single sound cut through the chatter. The applause of a man whose suit was sharper than the chandelier's glare. The CEO himself, worth millions, leaned forward, his voice carrying over the room. "Funny," he said. "I just signed a $4 million contract with her name on it." The room went still. My parents' smiles faltered. They thought this humiliation would break me, but they had no idea what was coming. By the time I was 12, I had already learned what my role was in the family. While other kids were outside chasing kites or laughing in the park, I was scrubbing the kitchen floor, the smell of bleach clinging to my skin long after the tiles gleamed. My parents never asked my brothers to do chores. They were too busy with schoolwork or too important to be distracted. But me? I was the one handed the mop, the laundry basket, the grocery list. I told myself it was temporary, that if I worked hard enough, if I stayed quiet and obedient, maybe one day they'd look at me with pride instead of annoyance. But pride was reserved for my brothers, especially Daniel. He was the golden child, the one they paraded in front of neighbors, the one whose trophies lined the living room shelves. Every time I dusted those trophies, I felt the sting of invisibility. My accomplishments, small but hard-earned, were never displayed. My school certificates, my community awards, the side projects I quietly worked on, they vanished into a drawer. My mother once said, "Those things don't matter. You should focus on being useful." That word became my cage. I remember one night in particular. I had just come home from working a part-time job at a local office, exhausted from filing papers and answering phones all day. I found my father sitting in his recliner, his favorite whiskey glass sweating on the side table. "Where's dinner?" he asked, without even looking up. "I just got home," I said carefully. "Give me a few minutes, and I'll—" He lowered the newspaper, his eyes narrowing. "Excuses again? You sound lazy. Do you think the world owes you something? Your brother would never come home empty-handed." I swallowed the lump in my throat. My brother didn't even cook for himself, but in their eyes, he could do no wrong. Later that evening, when everyone else had eaten and left the plates scattered across the table, I found myself alone in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes under cold water. My hands ached, but I didn't stop. Not because I wanted to, but because no one else would. It was during moments like these that I clung to one small object, a worn leather notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. Inside, I wrote down my dreams, my ideas, even sketches of the projects I wanted to create someday. The notebook was my secret sanctuary, its pages filled with plans far bigger than the four walls of that house. It was proof, to myself at least, that I was more than what they said. But my parents didn't just dismiss me. They humiliated me whenever they could. One Sunday afternoon during a family barbecue, my relatives gathered in the backyard. The air was thick with the smell of charcoal and grilled meat. I was running back and forth, carrying trays, refilling drinks, collecting plates. Sweat dripped down my back as I balanced too many dishes at once. Then my mother's voice cut through the chatter. "Don't she look natural?" Our very own Maid. The guests chuckled. Even my cousin smirked. My father grinned, raising his glass as if it were a toast. The shame burned hotter than the sun overhead. I forced a smile, but inside, something snapped. It wasn't just the joke. It was the way everyone accepted it, as if my worth had been permanently stamped and sealed. That humiliation stayed with me, replaying in my mind during sleepless nights. I'd stare at the ceiling, my body aching from the day's work, and wonder if this was all my life would ever be. But deep down, a quiet fire burned. I told myself, one day I'll prove them wrong. One day they'll see who I really am. What I didn't know then was how far they'd go to keep me in that role, and how much it would cost me before the truth finally broke free. And that Sunday barbecue? It was only the first sting. Much worse was coming. The older I got, the heavier the weight of their expectations became. Not expectations of greatness, just servitude. By the time I was in college, my days followed a punishing rhythm. Lectures in the morning, part-time job in the afternoon, chores at night. While my classmates joined study groups or laughed over pizza, I was wiping down counters, folding laundry, and listening to my parents' endless comparisons. Daniel's boss says he's management material already, my father would brag. Then he'd glance at me, his tone sharpening. What about you? Filing papers? That's not a career. Each word dug deeper, like stones filling my pockets. The worst was how they painted me to others. My mother, the queen of polite cruelty, had a way of turning me into a punchline. At family gatherings, she'd whisper just loud enough. She's still struggling, poor thing. Doesn't have Daniel's brains or charm, but at least she helps around the house. The relatives would nod, clucking their tongues in false pity. I wanted to scream that I was working twice as hard, balancing bills, keeping the house running, but no one wanted to hear my side. The isolation grew sharper when neighbors got involved. Rumors trickled through our tight-knit street that I was lazy, unambitious, a burden to my parents. I'd catch the sideways glances at the grocery store, hear the pity in their voices when they asked about Daniel's promotion, but never about me. Sleep became a stranger. Nights blurred into long hours of staring at my ceiling, heart pounding as if even rest was a luxury I didn't deserve. My body bore the proof. Dark circles under my eyes, trembling hands from exhaustion, an ache in my chest that never fully left. I began to wonder if maybe my parents were right. Maybe I really was only good for cleaning, cooking, serving. But life has a strange way of throwing you lifelines when you least expect them. One evening, after another brutal day, I sat alone at a coffee shop near campus, my notebook open in front of me. I was sketching out ideas for a proposal I'd been dreaming about, a contract that could change everything if it ever saw daylight. The numbers added up, the strategy felt solid, but doubt gnawed at me. Who was I to think I could win something so big? That's when a voice interrupted. You've been staring at that page for 20 minutes. Either you're stuck, or you're onto something huge. I looked up to see a man in his late 30s with kind eyes and a laptop under his arm. He introduced himself as Marcus, a project manager from a local firm. He explained that he'd been watching me scribble furiously, curiosity getting the better of him. I hesitated, but something about his tone disarmed me. I showed him a page from my notebook. To my shock, he didn't laugh. He leaned forward, scanning the numbers, nodding slowly. "This is good," he said. "Really good. You know, most people would kill to have ideas like this. Why aren't you doing more with it?" Heat rushed to my face. "Because no one believes I can." He studied me for a long moment, then smiled. "Then maybe you've been listening to the wrong people." Those words lodged themselves in my chest like a spark catching on dry wood. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a maid, not as a disappointment, but as someone capable. When we parted ways, Marcus handed me his card. "If you ever want to talk through this idea, call me." Don't let it rot in a notebook. I tucked the card into my pocket, my hands trembling. Walking home that night, the street seemed less suffocating, the stars overhead brighter than usual. I clutched my notebook like a lifeline. For the first time in a long time, a thought surfaced that I hadn't allowed myself to believe. Maybe I wasn't alone in this fight. And that realization, it was the beginning of everything. If Marcus's encouragement had been a spark, my parents were determined to stamp it out. The more I poured myself into my proposal, the more they sensed something was shifting, and they hated it. They had built their authority on the belief that I was powerless. Any sign of independence threatened to unravel the narrative they had spun for years. It started subtly. My father began monitoring my schedule more closely. "Where are you going?" he'd ask whenever I grabbed my bag. "Don't tell me you're wasting time on some fantasy project again." Then came the guilt. My mother would sigh loudly as I left for the library. Must be nice running off while I cook and clean. Some of us don't have the luxury of chasing daydreams. I bit my tongue, even as my knuckles whitened around my notebook. But the real blow came one evening when I returned home to find them waiting in the living room, Daniel smirking beside them. My father's voice was sharp. "We've made a decision," he said. "You need to stop this nonsense. All these hours you spend working. For what? You're neglecting your duties here. Your brother is advancing in his career, and you're scribbling in a notebook like a child." My stomach sank. "It's not nonsense," I whispered. "It's a contract proposal. If it goes through, it could—" "Enough!" My mother's voice cracked like a whip. "You'll embarrass yourself. Worse, you'll embarrass us. Do you think a company would ever trust you with something so important?" "Be realistic," Daniel chuckled. "She can barely manage the house. Who would hand her a real contract?" The words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. My throat burned, my heart hammered. I thought about shouting, about defending myself, but years of conditioning pinned me silent. Then my father pulled out a sheet of paper and slid it across the table. It was a family agreement, hastily typed, demanding that I contribute more hours to the household and prioritize family obligations over personal distractions. Personal distractions. That's what they called my dream. When I didn't immediately sign, my father's tone grew colder. "If you won't respect this family, maybe you shouldn't live under this roof. But don't think you can manage out there on your own. The world will eat you alive." For a moment, I believed him. I saw myself penniless, homeless, humiliated. The fear was suffocating, but then I remembered Marcus's words. "You've been listening to the wrong people." I looked at the paper again, then at their expectant faces. My hand trembled, but instead of reaching for the pen, I slid the paper back across the table. "No," I said softly. "I won't sign away my future." Silence slammed down on the room. My parents' faces hardened. Daniel's smirk faltered. My mother's voice dripped with venom. "You'll regret this." Maybe I would. My chest was tight, my knees weak, but underneath the fear was something else. A strange calm, like the eye of a storm. What they didn't know was that I'd already sent my proposal to a potential client with Marcus's help. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And if it worked, it could change everything. As I climbed the stairs to my room that night, their angry voices echoing below, I knew one thing for certain. They thought they still had control. They didn't. And soon they would realize it. Refusing to sign that agreement was like striking a match in a room filled with gasoline. My parents exploded in fury, and when their anger didn't bend me, they turned to something more dangerous: control through humiliation. The first attack came through relatives. Suddenly, cousins I hadn't spoken to in months were calling with backhanded concern. "I heard you're struggling," one said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Your parents say you're obsessed with some fantasy contract and it's ruining family harmony." Another messaged me on social media, "Maybe you should stop embarrassing yourself. Just settle down and help your parents like a good daughter." I stared at the words until the screen blurred. They weren't just trying to shame me privately anymore. They were building an army. Next came the neighbors. At the grocery store, Mrs. Callahan raised her brows as I walked past. "Your poor parents," she murmured, "carrying the whole household while you chase. Whatever it is you think you're doing." The whispers followed me everywhere, sharp as knives. At night, the weight of it pressed so hard on my chest that I could barely breathe. I'd toss and turn, replaying their words, fighting the poisonous thought that maybe they were right. But then I'd reach under my pillow, pull out my worn leather notebook, and trace the faded cover with my fingers. Inside were the pages Marcus had helped me refine. Cleaner, sharper, professional. Each sketch and calculation was a reminder that I wasn't delusional. I was building something real. And that notebook became more than just paper and ink. It became my shield. So I shifted tactics. Instead of reacting to their lies, I documented everything: dates, conversations, every attempt at manipulation. I saved text messages, screenshotted posts, even recorded a few heated exchanges when their threats crossed the line. For years, I had played the role of obedient servant, keeping my head down. But now I was becoming something else. A strategist. Marcus noticed the change. One afternoon at the cafe, he leaned across the table. "You're different lately," he said. "Stronger. Focused." "I don't have a choice," I admitted. "If I let them win, I'll lose myself forever." He smiled. "Then don't let them. Contracts aren't just about numbers. They're about leverage. You're learning how to create yours." His faith in me steadied the ground beneath my feet. Meanwhile, my parents doubled down. They told neighbors I was unstable, told relatives I was ungrateful, even hinted that I might be mentally unwell. Daniel, of course, played the role of golden boy, the reasonable sibling who only wanted what was best for me. The irony was sharp. The more they tried to paint me as weak, the stronger I became. Because while they wasted energy tearing me down, I was building. Late nights at the library turned into drafts of professional contracts. Calls with Marcus turned into strategy sessions. Every cruel word they flung became fuel for the fire. And then something shifted. An email, a subject line that made my hands tremble before I even opened it. Preliminary approval, contract discussion. It wasn't a full win yet, but it was the first green light. Proof that my work had weight, that my dream wasn't just scribbles in a notebook. I sat there staring at the screen, tears stinging my eyes. For the first time, I had something undeniable, something they couldn't laugh away or shove into a drawer. But instead of celebrating, a chill crept over me, because I knew what my parents were capable of. If they had already turned half the neighborhood against me, what would they do when they realized I was actually winning? I closed my notebook, pressing it to my chest, my heart beat wild. The day of reckoning was coming, and no one could stop it. The day of the contract meeting arrived like the final act of a storm. The company's headquarters loomed tall, glass panels gleaming in the morning sun. My reflection stared back at me in the revolving doors, tired eyes, but steady. For once, I didn't see a servant. I saw someone who belonged. Inside, the air was cool, humming with the quiet efficiency of success. Executives moved briskly, their shoes clicking against polished floors. I clutched my notebook, now neatly bound in a professional folder. Every page inside had been revised, checked, perfected. But my parents weren't finished with me. They arrived uninvited, striding into the lobby with Daniel in tow. My mother's voice dripped honey as she announced, "We're here to support our daughter." The receptionist glanced at me. My stomach twisted, but I lifted my chin. "They're not with me," I said firmly. My father's eyes narrowed, his whisper sharp enough to cut. "Don't forget who raised you. Don't you dare shame us in there." For years that tone had silenced me, but not today. Today, I walked past them without another word. The conference room was vast, sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. A long table stretched across the room, where the CEO and board members sat waiting. Their expressions were unreadable, pens poised, papers stacked neatly. I began my presentation. My voice trembled at first, but as the words flowed, so did my confidence. I spoke of market gaps, innovative strategies, long-term projections. The numbers lit up on the screen, crisp and undeniable. Halfway through, the door creaked open. My parents slipped inside, settling into chairs at the back. Daniel folded his arms smugly. The CEO raised a brow but allowed me to continue. My pulse thundered, but I refused to falter. And then, it happened. My father cleared his throat loudly. "Excuse me," he said, standing. "Before you get carried away, I think these executives should know the truth. She's not capable of handling something of this scale. She's always been irresponsible. This contract will fall apart if you trust her." Gasps rippled softly around the room. My mother added quickly, "We've spent years cleaning up after her. She's not who she pretends to be." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to me. For a heartbeat, panic clawed at my throat. Then I opened my folder. "Funny," I said calmly, "because every projection, every calculation, every plan in here is mine. Verified, cross-checked, and now preliminarily approved by your own analysts." I walked to the head of the table, sliding documents across to the CEO. I may have been underestimated, dismissed, even humiliated. But the numbers don't lie. This isn't about my family's opinion. It's about results. The CEO flipped through the pages, his expression sharpening. Finally, he looked up. "This is impressive work. Very impressive." I turned slowly toward my parents. Their faces had drained of color. Daniel's smirk had cracked. "For years," I said, my voice steady, "you told me I was only good for serving. For scrubbing floors, for silencing myself. But today proves what I've always known deep down. I am more than your maid. I am worthy. And I don't need apologies. I want change." The room was utterly still. My mother's hands trembled in her lap. My father's jaw worked soundlessly, as if words had abandoned him. The CEO extended his hand across the table. "Congratulations. We'd be honored to work with you." The applause that followed was like thunder in my ears. For once, the laughter in the room wasn't at my expense. It was joy, respect, acknowledgement. And behind me, in the corner where my parents sat, their empire of control collapsed into silence. When the meeting ended, I walked out of that building with the contract folder pressed against my chest, sunlight warming my face. Behind me, my parents trailed in silence, their footsteps slower than mine. For the first time in my life, I didn't look back to see if they were proud. I didn't need to. That night, the house was different. No shouting, no commands, no smug laughter from Daniel. Just silence. My father nursed his whiskey in the corner, staring into the glass as if answers might rise from the amber liquid. My mother sat rigid on the couch, her hands twisted in her lap. Daniel had vanished upstairs, slamming his door like a child. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Their power had cracked, not because I fought them with fists or insults, but because I'd finally refused to play the role they'd written for me. Within weeks, everything shifted. The company announced the contract publicly, my name attached to it. The same relatives who once pitied me now flooded my phone with congratulations. Neighbors who had whispered rumors stopped meeting my eyes. Respect, once denied to me, now arrived in abundance. But I had learned something crucial. Respect from others meant nothing if I didn't respect myself first. So I made changes. Real ones. I moved out of my parents' house and into a small but sunlit apartment. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Every chair, every plate, every picture frame chosen by me. No one could order me around there. No one could strip me down with a single word. Daniel visited once, trying to reassert his old superiority. He wandered through my apartment, smirking. Nice place. But don't get comfortable. Success doesn't last forever. I smiled politely, walked him to the door, and closed it behind him. His words no longer held chains. As for my parents, they tried to repair their image. At gatherings, they spoke of me differently now, calling me hardworking and determined, as if they had always believed in me. I didn't correct them, but I didn't let them rewrite history either. When people congratulated me, I accepted it fully, letting the truth speak for itself. The leather notebook, the one I once kept hidden under my mattress, now sat framed on my desk. The pages, filled with scribbles and dreams, were no longer a secret. They were the foundation of my future. Sometimes, when I ran my fingers over the worn cover, I remembered the girl who wrote in it late at night, tears smudging the ink, praying for a way out. That girl had survived. And now, she had become someone her parents could never diminish again. Life moved forward with momentum I had never imagined. New opportunities blossomed from the contract. Marcus became not just a mentor, but a true friend, one who reminded me, over coffee and laughter, that my worth had never depended on anyone else's approval. And yet, the greatest change wasn't the money, the recognition, or the career. It was the quiet of my own apartment after a long day, when I could cook or not cook, clean or not clean, simply because it was my choice. The quiet of nights when I lay in bed, no longer replaying insults, but planning futures. Sometimes I thought back to that first barbecue, when my mother had laughed and called me their maid. I remembered the sting, the shame, the way the guests had chuckled. And then I looked around at the life I had built. The contrast was so sharp it almost felt cinematic, the opening humiliation versus this final empowerment. This wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. And as I gazed at the framed notebook on my desk, I whispered to myself, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. So that was my journey, from being treated like a maid in my own family, to standing in a boardroom, proving my worth on a $4 million contract. But here's the truth. My story isn't just mine. Have you ever faced favoritism, betrayal, or the abuse of power from people who were supposed to support you? Have you ever been underestimated, mocked, or told you weren't enough? I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments, because when we speak our truths, we remind each other that we're not alone. And remember this. Worth isn't something they give you. It's something you claim for yourself. This isn't the end, for me or for you. It's the beginning.